Good evening, good morning, good afternoon. This is Carrie Freed from the Office of Inclusive Excellence.
And I'm Dr. Alyssa Alonso with the Student Counseling Center, the staff psychologist and liaison for diversity and inclusion.
And we are back with our second episode of our Women's Empowerment Bootcamp recap series, where we are recapping the conversation, discussion, and psychoeducation that took place during our Women's Empowerment Bootcamp. Last week, we talked about building better boundaries, and we left off with a challenge. Dr. Alonso, would you like to remind us of what that challenge was?
I'd love to, Carrie. So the challenge for our first session was looking at our relationship to ourselves and the boundaries we set and how we maintain those boundaries. So the challenge was taking a day in your week and observing when you meet or do not meet your physical needs, such as taking a drink when you're thirsty, going to the bathroom when you need to use the restroom, and looking at how that impacts your well-being when you meet or don't meet those needs. So for those of you who did not get an opportunity to listen to our first session, highly encourage you to click away and go back to our first session and do this challenge for yourself.
Absolutely. And we were able to have a discussion with our participants in the second week that really talked about how establishing boundaries is a lot easier when you know why you're establishing them, right? So part of knowing your worth and part of knowing your values is so that you can make decisions that align with the things that you want in life, right? Part of being empowered is going forth and moving towards the things that make you happy, that fulfill you, and that leave you feeling energized and refreshed at the end of the day, instead of how so many of us, especially who are conditioned in womanhood, right, feel this empty and draining and this lack, this deficit, right? Because we're not living lives that fulfill us or that are aligned with what it is that we really want or what it is we find important. So super exciting to be back for this next session and talking about boundaries. I think so far, I mean, we've only had 2 sessions, but this is probably my favorite conversation so far, because our discussion question this week started off on a really high note. And unironically, we were having this discussion on International Women's Day. So what a great way to bring in this conversation about what does society tell us makes a woman valuable? And wow, that was such a heavy question to bring into the room, but such a needed question. And I'm so thankful to our participants for giving us the space to dive in. You all listening, this was an hour-long conversation. Like, it was so juicy and full of things that I'm really excited to say that we gave space to talk about. So many of us have all of these messages coming into us about, as people who identify as women, what we should be doing, what we shouldn't be doing, what should we wear, how many kids we should have, all of these things, right? And so it was a conversation that I think brought forth this idea that as women and people who identify as women, we're often told that we need to be productive, we need to be able to do it all, we need to be able to handle it all, but at the same time, we need to handle our emotions, we need to withhold our opinions. We can't take up too much space, right? If we're too emotional, then we're irrational. If we're irrational, that means we're crazy. You know, our participants talked a lot about that fear of being assertive versus being the B word, right? The big B word. If you are somebody that establishes boundaries, or if you say what it is that you want, then all of a sudden you're perceived in a different way. We really spoke about that double standard of, you know, as a woman, I'm not allowed to come into a room and say something and I'm perceived as the B word. But if a man says almost the exact same thing, now he's an assertive leader. And so much of society tells us that whatever it is that a woman does, if it doesn't involve children and if it doesn't involve marriage, then there is a certain way that she can do it. And she can't be better than a man, for sure. And so again, this conversation was so fruitful because it really made us think about, right, that double standard that we have and the history of womanhood, right? So when we look back at why marriage was important hundreds of years ago, why having children was important hundreds of years ago, what we're really looking at is that marriage served as a tool for survival, right? So women necessarily weren't allowed to have land and property and wealth and jobs, right? But they were allowed to maintain the home, and they were allowed to to reproduce so that we could build a better empire for our families, right? When you look at kings and queens, the queen was not in the room talking about war, right? She was next door having babies and hopefully having a boy or a few boys, right? So that there would be a succession to this legacy. And so much of the patriarchy leans into that, right? That the woman's role in society is to be some sort of stepping stone for the man's greatness and for him to be able to have the space to grow his family and to conquer in his own way, right? And so now here we are, fast forward to the 21st century, right? And that is no longer the case, right? Until I think, right, we talked about the 70s, women barely even had credit or still were having a hard time buying their own homes. And that's not 300 years ago. That's almost yesterday, right? My mom was born in 1973. So I'm so close to this generation where women are kind of confined in this box. And I see it so much in Gen Z, this inability to fit in any type of structure, right? And I love and I admire that authenticity in them. So I was so excited, Alyssa, about this conversation because it set this fire in me that reminded me that women are so worthy and able to take up space. And in this day and age, it gave me such inspiration about where we're moving towards in terms of Gen Z and being leaders in the world of Gen Z and having Gen Z as our leader someday gets me really excited because of the conversation that came today, right? And how Gen Z and the people that participated in our camp see women.
And that was one of the most invigorating things about this conversation. I wholeheartedly agree with you, Carrie, because part of the great thing about the conversation was like the level of nuance and detail we were able to have. And that's one thing we really encourage you as our listeners to really reflect on and think about is like, for you, what have messages have you received from our society, from family, from friends throughout your life of what makes women valuable?
Mm-hmm.
And really being able to think in a complex way about that. So what does it mean to be like too much, to be too sensitive, to have too many opinions? What does it mean to have to be like a strong woman? What does it mean that these double standards exist, especially around sex and sexual acts and sexual relationships, that men and women are treated differently and viewed differently in these different pieces in our society? And so really being able to sit with those pieces. And one of the interesting parts of the discussion that came out when we were talking about double standards is thinking about athletics and how women in athletics get viewed and how men in athletics are viewed. So really being able to sit with a bunch of these really timely, important concerns and what that means. And at the end of our conversation, one of the things that really came up is like, if we're talking about like these double standards and what society says about what makes women valuable, and who sets that standard?
Yeah, who decided that? Who decided that at the end of the day? And, we can look back at history and I think it kind of leads itself to be pretty obvious, right? Who have been the leaders in our world? Who have been the people who have been the writers of history? I mean, quite literally, we can look to see historians more so often are not women, right? And they're definitely not women of color, and they're definitely not non-binary, right? Not yet, anyway. Gen Z, I'm holding out on you, but they're not yet there, right? And so much of our history and so much of what's been decided has been decided through the male lens. And that conditioning of manhood also allows a whole other set of things to not be able to be seen as valuable, right? Because even as men, there are lots of standards that men are held up against that don't allow them to be their full and expansive selves. And I think that that's part of this empowerment, is realizing that our society doesn't always allow us, and these check boxes that we're often asked to fill out don't allow us to be our full expansive selves, and often make us feel like the standards have already been set and therefore they can't be adjusted to fit and accommodate us more truthfully.
Well, and I think that's one of the steps we wanted to take in this session of our empowerment camp, is really thinking about how we can empower women to look at how they can set those standards for themselves. that yes, our society gives us these messages, and we talked some about the internalization of these messages and how that can impact our mental health and the way we see ourselves and the way we do things, but really wanting to focus on the empowerment piece of looking at what we do and how we set those values for ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the main exercises we did during this session is called a values compass.
Mm-hmm.
And essentially what that is looking at 10 different domains of value. So these domains include family relationships, romantic partner relationships, social relationships, education, career, spirituality, physical health, and several other domains. So what we asked our participants to do was to have conversations with each other and then to reflect on their own of what in these domains is important to them. So really digging into themselves as individuals in connection with the people in their lives and what's valuable.
Right.
Because the point of the values compass is it's a compass.
Mm-hmm.
Where you're supposed to use it to guide and direct your activity, guide and direct your decision making.
Mm-hmm.
Because one thing that can be really tempting is to make decisions based on the other people in our lives.
Right.
Or make decisions based on how we're feeling in that moment.
Right. Or even make decisions based on what society tells us is appropriate. Right. So a lot of what we talked about, and I'm so thankful too that we've had a very diverse group of participants, because so many of them brought that identity with them into the room, right? That strong Black woman or that Latino woman that cares for everyone first, right? And so when we look at a values compass, being a strong Black woman might order those 10 things in a different way, right? They might say the most important thing is your family, or the Latino, for example, right? The most important thing is to take care of your husband and take care of the kids. Right. That's the most, make sure they're fed, make sure the house looks good, all of those things. That's the most important thing. Education might be number 8 on the list, right? That's not the most important thing. So society has set those standards and laid those values out for you. But if you could reimagine what those look like, if you could reorder them in the way that is most true for you, I wonder what that would look like for you. And would you have the same order that your culture tells you is most appropriate? Probably not.
Well, and so digging into that to figure out like where you are as an individual. And that was something that we asked our participants to do. And you, our listeners, that's something we're asking you to reflect on for today, is determining what you value and where that goes. Another hugely important part of this conversation that we talked about is time and energy are limited resources.
Limited.
You can't do everything.
Mm-mm.
Doesn't matter what our society, the messages our society tells us.
Whether you're a man or a woman or non-binary or anything, there's just only so much time and there's only so much energy, no matter what.
Yeah. So the next challenge is, once you know what's valuable to you, how do you decide what to prioritize? And if those priorities look one way today and look another way tomorrow, right? And really being able to sit with yourself and figure out what's important and how do you act on that?
And maybe even how are your boundaries reflecting that as well, right? So walking away and saying physical fitness, that's the number one thing that is the most important to me. But how many times in a week do you decide to keep working instead of going to the gym before it closes? Or how many times did you decide not to eat that day instead of filling your body with nutritious things to make sure you can actually work out and not pass out during your workout? I am guilty as charged. So I love this conversation, not only because I think it's very timely and relevant as International Women's Day, right? But also timely and relevant in that we're living in a society in America today that often does not care much about the individual. Hardly cares about the whole, really, but more so cares less about the individual if that means that a profit can be made, right? So many times we're told, oh, that job can just replace you. So many times we're told you're just another number, right? And so many times, how many times have we been in like a number queue, right? On the phone, waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting, and it just feels like our concern isn't, big enough or strong enough or something, right? But how often are we even asked, what is it that you want out of life, right? Do you want to be a mother? Do you want to be someone that takes care of the home, right? Do you want to have a career? Do you want to be educated? What is it that you're interested in? And how can we as a community support those interests and foster those interests, right? Out of you. So often our families even not really in tune with what it is that we want, and maybe even have conflicting messages about what it is that we want, right? Our participants brought up this strong Black woman mentality, right? And it's like, I'm tired of being strong and holding up things and like, keeping it all together, and how harmful that message can be, especially in minoritized populations. And I'm so thankful to our group for bringing that up, because that's what I'm saying is like, you're so right. It's that the messages are so loud. They are so loud because they're coming from everywhere. And you never in your education and your upbringing have an opportunity to look and say, wait, where do these things rank for me? You all have just thrown them down my throat in some way or the other, and I never got the opportunity to see what my options are and rank them for myself. So the challenge, I think, is something that's hopefully going to be very fruitful for our participants, and I'm really excited to see what they bring back with us next week to talk about how they fed more into their values, or how they even maybe use their boundaries to establish a stronger pathway towards their values.
Yeah, so that leading into the challenge for the week, Carrie, the challenge for the week is to take the values compass that they completed during the session and be really attentive and mindful in the next 2 weeks to think about how their behaviors are either aligning or not aligning with the way that they've ranked their values. And so trying to see how they feel when they make a choice, uphold a boundary that allows them to meet one of their values, and to see what happens or what's going on when they're unable to act in a way that aligns with their values.
Yeah. And, I'm really excited and thankful too for this education you've given us, Dr. Alonso, because I think so many of us are searching for this kind of concrete guidance into figuring out who we are. Like I mentioned, Gen Z is a generation like unlike any other, right? All of our generations are unique, sure. But Gen Z is living in a world where authenticity matters more than anything. Being able to come into a space and be who I am and be accepted for who I am and be encouraged to be who I am is something that is like a number one priority for Gen Z people, and I love that, because I think that how else can we move into the world and make sense of this human experience that we're having if we're not living in our truth? And how hard is it to find that, right? In a world in which social media is everywhere, and these messages aren't just messages that are being told to us by our moms and our teachers, but by everyone, strangers, billboard signs, right? Like all the messages, they're in the pictures, they're in the ads, they're in the way we show up to class, in the way that we're asked to dress, and all of these things. And I think one of the biggest things that I've had to think about in terms of my womanhood is like redefining what that means, right? What does a strong Black woman look like? And what do I want it to look like, right? And can I just make up the answer for myself? And I think that's so true. I think we can. And so that was another part of a challenge for our participants, is to really think about what makes strong women. And is it really what society has set for us, right? Is it really for what the men have set for us, or is that up to us to decide? I think it is.
Well, and part of that empowerment is doing exactly what you said, Carrie, reframing what it means to be a woman and reframing what it means to be a strong woman. And that's a choice and values that we all get to establish for ourselves.
Well, I'm really excited about this week. And UND is on spring break next week, so we have a week off. And then we'll be coming back with our third part in the series. We're calming the storm. We're talking about conflict resolution and what it looks like to communicate effectively when we do have all of the big feelings and everything. And it's sometimes hard for us to trust that other people want the best for us. So what does it look like to resolve conflict? And maybe even how do our values and our boundaries create or dissolve conflict for us? So I'm really excited. Tune back in next week, and we will see you all soon.